100,000 years ago, someone covered a dead body in red powder, not for any practical reason. It didn't preserve the corpse, didn't keep scavengers away. They did it anyway. The people doing it may not have been entirely human in the way you'd define it. Some of them were a different species, because once you see enough sites like this, a different question starts showing up. It's not really a question about burial. It's about the exact moment a body stopped being just a body and started being something a species felt it had to respond to. Start with the evidence itself. Red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide ground into powder. At Qafzeh Cave in Israel, a burial site roughly 100,000 years old, researchers found a skeleton with ochre residue still clinging to the bone. Not a trace. A deliberate covering. Someone ground a mineral into dust and applied it to a corpse, for reasons that have nothing to do with survival. Think about what that actually means. Somebody spent time preparing red powder, then spread it across a body that would never know it was there. Color as meaning. A final act performed for someone who could no longer see it. Now go back further to a site where the species responsible isn't even certain. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, archaeologists excavating Neanderthal remains in the 1960s found clusters of ancient flower pollen concentrated directly around a buried skeleton. The claim was bold. Neanderthals had laid flowers on their dead. For decades, that claim was attacked. Critics argued the pollen could have blown in or been dragged in by burrowing animals. Then in 2023, a re-excavation using modern techniques found something the original team couldn't have detected. The pollen clustered in a pattern that matched deliberately placed flowering branches, not wind-blown debris. The body had been positioned in a hollow, then covered with the branches, by hands that weren't modern human hands at all. If that holds, the instinct to mark death with ritual isn't something our species invented. It's older than we are. Move forward to about 100,000 years ago at Skhul Cave, also in Israel. A human skeleton buried in a deliberately dug pit, knees drawn to the chest, a position archaeologists call flexed burial. In the skeleton's hands, the jawbone of a wild boar, placed there on purpose. Not nearby, not scattered, held. A boar jaw doesn't decompose into anything useful. It's a grave good, an object given to a body that will never use it again. Someone believed this person needed something, somewhere, after they stopped breathing. And then the evidence stops being subtle entirely. At a site called Sungir in western Russia, roughly 34,000 years old, investigators found two adolescents buried head-to-head, covered in over 13,000 carved ivory beads. Archaeologists tried recreating the beads with period-accurate tools just to time the process. Each one took about 45 minutes to carve by hand. Beside the bodies, spears made from heated, slowly straightened mammoth tusks, objects the dead would never use again. Archaeologists estimate the beadwork alone required more than 10,000 hours of labor. 10,000 hours from a community that couldn't afford to waste one. This impulse didn't stay confined to humans either. At a site called Bonn Oberkassel in Germany, roughly 14,000 years old, archaeologists found two human skeletons buried together with the remains of a dog. Not a wild animal that wandered into the grave by accident. A dog deliberately interred alongside the people. When researchers examined its teeth and jaw decades later, they found something that changed the entire reading of the site. The dog had been desperately sick as a puppy, infected with a brutal, often fatal illness. The damage to its teeth showed it had been sick for weeks, maybe longer, and it survived those weeks. Somebody nursed a dying puppy back from the edge with no practical reason to do so. A sick animal offers nothing useful, costs food and time, and risks nothing improving. They kept it alive anyway, and when it eventually died, they buried it like a person. That's not domestication, that's care. Extended across a species line 14,000 years before anyone wrote the word pet. What's strange is that other animals get surprisingly close to this behavior. Elephants do, chimpanzees do. Elephants will stand near a dead herd member for hours, sometimes touching the body with their trunks, sometimes returning to the same spot weeks later. Chimpanzees have been observed carrying dead infants for days, grooming them long after death, refusing to set them down. Both look on the surface like grief, but neither builds a grave, neither selects an object and places it deliberately beside a body. The behavior stops at proximity and physical contact. It never crosses into ritual, into a symbolic act with a beginning, a structure, and an ending, repeated the same way by people who weren't there to witness the death themselves. That crossing point is the entire story. An elephant returning to a carcass is responding to loss in the moment. A community spending 10,000 hours on beads, generations after the practice began, is performing a tradition it inherited. Burial costs energy and time, and offers zero survival advantage to the people doing the digging. By the cold math of natural selection, this behavior should have been bred out. It wasn't. It got more elaborate, not less ochre, to flowers, to grave goods, to 10,000 hours of carved ivory. One leading explanation: burial was never really for the dead. It was for the living. A way to stop watching a body decompose, a way to protect the group's mind rather than the corpse. It may have begun as a way to avoid watching someone you knew slowly disappear into decay. Ritual may have started as something closer to a coping mechanism, then accumulated meaning over thousands of generations, until covering a body in red dust felt less like hygiene and more like devotion. But that doesn't explain the boar jaw, and it definitely doesn't explain choosing flowers when any branch would have done the job. Once you're choosing objects, choosing colors, choosing positions, you've crossed out of problem solving and into belief. And that crossing happened earlier and in more species than anyone expected. This is the real story underneath all of it. Somewhere in deep time, a species looked at a dead body and reached a conclusion that feels obvious to us now. This deserves something. Not food, not shelter, something else. That single shift multiplied across tens of thousands of years is the difference between a corpse and a grave. 100,000 years ago at qafzeh, someone covered a body in pigment for no functional reason. Possibly earlier at Shanidar, a Neanderthal was laid in a hollow and covered in flowers. At school, someone placed a wild boar's jaw into a dead person's hands. At Sungir, a community spent 10,000 hours on beads 2 children would wear into the ground and never wear again. At Bonn Oberkassel, someone nursed a dying puppy back to health for no practical reason at all, then buried it like family when it finally died. None of it kept anyone alive. By the logic of survival alone, none of it should have happened. It happened anyway, over and over until it reached you. Watching a video about people who buried their dead so long ago, the ground itself has changed shape since then. They didn't know you'd exist. They did it anyway. Somebody, somewhere down that line, decided a body deserved more than being left where it fell. And that decision is still being made, in roughly the same shape today. Subscribe.